Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us to discuss what we've learnt from our visits. I'm Zoe Allen Robinson. I manage the anti-money laundering proactive supervision team, and I'm joined by my colleague Ross Gilson, who is a regulatory manager in the team. He led on the latest published project and conducts a number of firm visits. Both of us are lawyers by background, and we're really keen to share with you the latest findings. So we want this session to be as interactive as possible. We've already had a number of questions sent in advance that we're picking up along the way, but you can submit live questions by clicking on the link below the video. You can include your name with questions, but also you have the option to do that anonymously. Also, the stream will be available on catch up, and the slides and links to relevant guidance that we discuss will be on the resources page for this event. So do feel free to check those out, or also share with colleagues if you think this is something that they'd find useful. So before I hand over to Ross, who's going to go through some of the key findings in detail, I thought it might be helpful just to explain a bit about the work of the team and what to expect if we were to get in touch with your firm. So we conduct on a rolling basis these visits. They're currently being undertaken remotely. We also do desk-based reviews where we look at firm-wide risk assessments, policies, controls and procedures and other AML documents, and a sample of files to assess the effectiveness of those processes. With the visits, they involve completion of a pre-questionnaire and a request again for documents, your policies, controls and procedures. The actual visit itself involves interviews with the money laundering compliance officer and money laundering reporting officer if they're different people. And we also allow firms, if you think there's anyone else that would be able to assist or contribute, that they can also attend those interviews. We like to speak to a couple of fee earners and also do some file reviews again to look at effectiveness and adequacy of controls. So we aim to try and give some feedback there and then. So after the visit, have a chat and give an idea of how it's gone. We may request further information or documents during the course of our engagement to get the full picture, and then we'll send on substantive feedback at the end, which could be a few different options in terms of giving guidance or doing some sort of engagement or a compliance plan. And we have had a question from Rebecca about if we visited a firm, what's the time frame for visiting them again, which is a really good question. Not a straightforward answer, unfortunately, because proactive supervision is driven by lots of risk factors. Risk is obviously changing frequently due to the information we get, and the intelligence picture changes. So that can have an impact on which firms we visit and how often, although we do try and not be too disruptive to firms and work on sort of avoiding visiting firms sort of over sort of a few year period. But this can be more frequent. It's not set in stone if there are those other factors that are relevant, such as mergers or a change in the regulations. So what I would stress here is that just because a firm may have been assessed as a higher risk or we've visited more frequently than that, that doesn't mean they're doing a bad job. It just may mean they're exposed to a greater risk, or there's a need for us to go in and sense check that mitigation again. So I'm just going to move on to give the high level findings. And you may have seen our publication on the visits we completed last year and know that this involved 74 firms. And you can see over 60% of the firms did require some form of engagement. So that's a shift in our role as a new team that we're looking at supervision. And that engagement could be asking for revised copy documents, asking firms to set out their plans to undertake an independent audit. It could also mean a compliance plan where we consider there are potential breachings or shortfalls and ask them to do certain corrective action within a set time frame, such as doing a sample of files to see if there's the extent of a customer due diligence issue, for example. And we are flexible if, particularly with COVID, that we will set timeframes, but if firms need to, renegotiate them because of their circumstances, we are open to that. And actually, a lot of we haven't had any difficulties with firms. We've been able to find something that works for both sides, which has been really good. So we know that firms are interested in the referral side, and there's only 9 firms that sort of have been referred, but I know you're keen to know sort of the circumstances, and from those cohort of visits we found that was where it was a real systemic issue, so where at least 50% of the files had serious issues such as a lack of due diligence altogether or lack of matter risk assessments. It even was where, say, a firm didn't have an AML policy or controls or procedures in place. Also where the money laundering compliance officer didn't seem to understand their obligations, or they were failing to carry out their role properly. Or it could be serious breaches around where it's clear that file needed enhanced checks and those weren't done. There weren't any source of funds evidenced on the file. In our current work, just to sort of give an update on the kinds of things that have been referred, this tends to be the minority, as you can see from those figures, but it could be where a firm haven't got a firm-wide risk assessment in place, which has been a requirement since June 2017. And this is a different document to an AML policy. It could also be we've taken enforcement action where a firm haven't trained their staff within a reasonable space of time, or where there's significant customer due diligence failings, for example, where a number of files were clearly high risk, they were high value transactions or cash purchases, and no source of funds or source of wealth checks had been undertaken. But Ross has led on this project, so I'm going to hand over to him now. He's going to focus on those areas and then pick back up with questions later.
Thank you, Zoe, and good afternoon, everybody. Right. So our report covers 10 particular areas where we found firms generally had more to do. Because we're limited this afternoon, we're going to focus on the 4 where we found that the highest number of firms had issues with them. Under Regulation 21, we've got audit, where firms frequently misunderstood that they were required to carry out an independent audit and crucially failed to test the effectiveness of their AML regime. And likewise, screening, where firms generally complied with the requirement to screen employees at the moment they're appointed, but not thereafter. And under Regulation 28, matter risk assessments, which were variously incomplete, inconsistent with the firm's risk assessment, or not completed at all. And finally, source of funds, where fee earners had made few inquiries or insufficient inquiries into where the funding for a particular transaction had come from. So to start with, we will look at audit. Now, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Right. The ingredients of an audit are as follows. They have to focus on the firm's policies, controls and procedures, and firstly they have to assess, is it adequate? Now that really means, is it up to date? And crucially, does it work for the firm? One size certainly doesn't fit all. The audit also has to assess the policy's effectiveness. So essentially, are people in the firm following it? This will usually mean file reviews as a way of testing adherence to it within the firm, but there may be other ways that firms want to check this. Now, independence. The audit does have to be independent, but this certainly doesn't mean that it needs to be external. Simply put, independence means, is the person carrying out the audit essentially marking their own homework? The MLCO, the MLRO, possibly the head of compliance, if you have one, or other people who are involved in drafting the policies, controls and procedures and overseeing them, shouldn't be the auditor. It should be a fresh pair of eyes. And this isn't necessarily any sort of comment on independence per se. It's also, if you've spent ages looking at the documents that you've been drafting, you're less likely to find errors in them. And lastly, recommendations. Now, part of the requirement for an audit is that recommendations are made and that they are followed through by the auditor to make sure that they are carried through and implemented. Most firms are doing some or all of these, but there's usually just a need to formalise them in a way that fits the regulations. This could be just adding in file reviews where none existed before, or it could mean making sure that the person in charge of an audit is going to be suitably independent. Another note here is that firms are required to do independent audits according to their size and nature. Now, firms will need to be able to justify if they don't think that an audit is necessary due to their size and nature. Only the very smallest firms and those which carry out potentially a very small amount of regulated work will be able to say that they don't need one on those grounds. Firms should ask themselves, can you be sure that there's sufficient oversight? Do they do particularly high risk work such as conveyancing or high value transactions or trusts and company services? Do they have multiple offices, mid-level management overseeing work that could mean that senior management are, so to speak, removed from the coalface? And also other factors potentially, such as having staff who are engaged in dealing with one particular high-risk area of work, such as conveyancers. Now, moving on to our findings on the next slide, please. Here are some of the things we found. I won't go through them all individually, but I think probably the biggest area where firms tended to fall down was effectiveness. So there was an annual check that things were up to date, the person was suitably independent, but nobody was really checking whether the fee earners were actually following the policies. And this was a recurring theme throughout this exercise and also the ones that we're undertaking at the moment, where we get a very rosy picture of compliance from the money laundering compliance officer, which then isn't followed up when we do file reviews. Okay, so now we're going to move on to screening. Now, just to get this right out at the beginning, screening does not necessarily mean disclosure and barring service checks for all staff. Firms are able to do that if they want and if they think it helps them and suits their risk profile. But it's not the only way to conduct screening. The ingredients of screening under the regs are that it covers all relevant employees. Now, this essentially means, is it directly relevant to their role? Or else might they be involved in the identification, mitigation, detection or prevention of money laundering? Realistically, that is going to mean most people in the firm except potentially maintenance or facilities staff. Firms generally make sure that everybody gets some form of screening when they enter the firm, but occasionally we see receptionists and the like being exempted. And of course, they have a role to play. They're often the first person in the firm to speak to a new client. Now, in terms of what screening actually is, the first ingredient of this is skills, knowledge, and expertise. This needs to be checked in a number of ways. And conduct and integrity is the other limb. So skills, knowledge, and expertise on the one hand, conduct and integrity on the other, and this is both before they're employed and during their employment. In practice, most firms are already doing some of this. So what could go towards conduct and integrity would be checking references. What could go to skills, knowledge, and expertise would be conducting appraisals during their employment with the firm, checking that their qualifications are what they say they are. And some firms will perform disclosure and barring service checks as they see fit. Realistically, though, I think this is most firms are missing out on one crucial aspect of this, which is regulatory checks, which we consider are, in terms of best practice, carried out both before they're employed and during their employment. And these are free to undertake. You can do it either by checking against solicitors and indeed other staff on the SRA solicitors register, or indeed if they are silexes, barristers, etc., CLC, checking with their own regulator. It's important to check regulatory history because we do know that not all employees are necessarily, unfortunately, open with their firms about these kinds of things. Some firms have things like an annual declaration, for example, that the employee hasn't committed any form of criminal or regulatory offence. And realistically, those perhaps shouldn't be relied upon exclusively. It is important to have some form of independent check. But again, as with audit, for most firms, it's just a question of tidying up this process and making sure that you're using as many different means as possible to do this. And crucially, maintaining records. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So, I think one thing to pick out of this is that at a few firms we went to, the money laundering compliance officer was unfamiliar with the firm's screening process. And they tended to say things like, oh, HR, look at that. Or we outsource it to a recruiter. It's absolutely fine for MLCOs who are, let's not forget, responsible for the firm's overall compliance with these regulations, to delegate certain tasks as and when they see fit. But they should understand what it is they're delegating and, crucially, what the delegated person is doing with this. Another thing is firms limiting screening to certain categories of staff. So, for example, it might be that some firms only screen on an ongoing basis their finance staff or their conveyancers, often because they're under some accreditation scheme that requires it. Now, firms should take a risk-based approach to this, of course, but it is important to remember that, for example, if you run a mixed high street practice, it's not only conveyancers that are at risk of money laundering, for example, transfers of shares, etc. Trusts, company formations are likely to pose a risk as well. Now, moving on to matter risk assessments. I think it's important to say that some firms do this very well, and we've seen cases where it's second nature to them and their fee earners. Others, of course, sadly, were not doing such a good job. Now, firms need to make sure that each matter file within the regulations is risk assessed. This doesn't need to be a forensic dissection, but some thought needs to go into it. I hesitate to use the word tick box exercise, because checklists can be a very good way of going towards this. But some thought does need to go into it, and it helps to understand the client and the transaction. It also acts as a healthy reminder as to the sort of things that the fee earner ought to know. Firms should be clear what they're expecting of staff when it comes to risk assessments, and they should make sure that it aligns with their policies, processes, and crucially with their firm-wide risk assessment. If a matter is rated as high risk in the firm-wide risk assessment, that should be reflected on the matter risk assessment. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to become a high-risk file, but it should be the starting point. Equally, the ratings that matters are given should be meaningful. If a matter is rated at high risk, that file should be treated differently to those which are medium or low risk. Fee earners should know what each rating means, and they should also know what sort of action is expected of them as a result of each rating. These form the basis of ongoing monitoring. They're a good reference point for fee earners to have. And I think this is sometimes an issue which comes to the fore when firms have an onboarding team, where we consider that if the fee earner themselves aren't gathering the client due diligence information, they should have access to it, they should understand it, and they should understand why it's received the risk rating it has. We occasionally come across firms where fee earners are not allowed to look at client due diligence and the risk assessment. Now, this is a clear risk for ongoing monitoring and, crucially, knowing their client. And on the next slide, we'll just look at some of the good and bad practice we encountered. I think, again, it's worth making the point that it's all very well having this risk assessment embedded in the firm's culture, but it does need to be recorded. Firms should be able, one solicitor I spoke to rather morbidly called it the under a bus principle. If I were to end up in traction for 6 months, would somebody be able to pick up my files and run with them as I would want them to be run? And recording your risk assessments is a good way of doing that. Okay, so now to move on to our final topic, source of funds. Right. Source of funds is defined by the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance as the funds that are being used to fund the particular transaction in hand. That really, I think, is the crux of this. You need to know where these particular funds are coming from. And some examples of these that I've found are where, for example, a firm I visited had a couple of clients, they were a couple in fact, who were buying a flat in London for several £1 million. When the firm looked back at the client onboarding form that they had, they saw that they were in very low income. I think one was somewhere in the care professions and the other one was a driver. And this didn't square at all with them having the kind of ready cash to buy a several £1 million London flat. So they made some inquiries directly with the client, and the client was able to tell them that they had in fact won the lottery. So the firm was able to approach Camelot, who gave them some reassurance that this was in fact the case. They spoke to the client's IFA, and they got hold of the client's bank accounts and saw where the money was coming from. Now, in that case, it was quite easy to establish both source of funds, which are the particular funds needed for the transaction, and the source of wealth, which is the firm's wider assets. The two are not synonymous, although they are often related, and it can be quite easy sometimes to allow what you think is your knowledge of the source of wealth to cloud your opinion of the source of funds. Now, if you consider that 3 different types of clients come into your firm, one is, say, a celebrity, well known for decades, who is known to have legitimate means of having made their fortune. Another one is somebody that you've known from school. Another one is somebody that you know from the golf club, for example, who's known as a successful local business. Regardless of your knowledge of the clients, you still need to know the source of the particular funds for the particular transaction. Don't assume. You never know what pressures people may be under. And this was brought home to me in a visit to a firm a couple of years ago when one of the partners told me a hair-raising story about a colleague of theirs who they'd known for years and was effectively now a friend as well as a colleague, who they worked alongside, who turned out to be being blackmailed by the mafia and was merrily pouring money through the firm's accounts, unbeknownst to anyone, until the police knocked on the door. Knowledge of people's circumstances and source of funds is very helpful, but definitely caution you against making assumptions based on what you think you know. You'll need to be mindful of how you achieve the other obligations in under the regulations as well, such as assessing the risk. Source of funds is a crucial part of assessing risk. And if you don't know the source of funds, you need to ask yourself, how can I tell whether this is medium or high risk matter? It's also important to talk about the timing of source of funds checks. Generally, it's good practice to carry this out at the earliest possible opportunity. Some firms we've spoken to don't get source of funds information until, for example, the stages of exchange or indeed completion in conveyances. Now, that really is asking for trouble. This could delay progress if the client didn't know it was needed from the outset. Could also, frankly, cause annoyance from a customer service point of view. More worryingly, if the source of funds can't be established or is so alarming that you need to put in a suspicious activity report, it is going to be far more disruptive at these crucial stages of the transaction than if you did it at the beginning. Finally, if you only rarely undertake source of funds checks, then you are putting yourself at risk of allowing criminal property into your client account, or assisting in a transaction where you don't hold funds that facilitates money laundering, and therefore committing an offence under the Proceeds of Crime Act. How comfortable would you be if the police came a-knocking, went through your client account and found that dirty money had been laundered through your firm and you hadn't undertaken any checks on that? Now, what these checks involve is a judgment. One of the questions we've had in asks, how far do solicitors need to go with source of wealth checks? For example, if a couple buying a house say they received a deposit as a gift from a grandparent, do we need to interrogate the grandparents as to how they came by the money gifted to the grandchild? Well, that's more a source of funds than a source of wealth. And really, it's looking, again, at the origin of these particular funds. This isn't a one-size-fits-all question. The answer is really you need to go back until it makes sense and until the account you've been given is deemed sufficient. Does the information you've been given beg a question? That's particularly helpful with things like gifts and money from third parties. Does it make sense? We do appreciate this is a challenging area, but just accepting somebody's word for where the monies came from for a particular transaction can be very risky. And finally, I think it's worth saying that we are all used, as part of everyday life, to having to provide documentation, potentially quite invasive documentation. The other year, I wanted to renew my library card, and they made me take my passport and 2 utility bills down, if you can believe it. Think as well as to the inconvenience that people go through when they're trying to travel by air, back in the days when we did travel by air. Hopefully we'll one again. You don't make your clients take their shoes off and scan them. Asking for their bank statements does seem small potatoes by comparison. And evasiveness to provide this information can give you an indication at an early stage of red flags in the transaction. So just going on to the final slide there. I think I've covered most of these, but one which I would like to just pull out is where firms collect bank statements in and just sort of put them on the file as a talisman against regulatory queries. Sometimes we get fee earners where they've just put client bank statements on the file after collecting them, but they haven't actually read them. And it can be very difficult sometimes when after the event we're going through and saying, okay, there's a transfer of £50,000 in here. Did you ask the client about that? Common sense and vigilance really are the watchwords here, as they are in most other areas of money laundering. And that takes me to the end of my section. So I think we have some time for questions now.
We do, and we've had quite a few questions, Ross. I'm going to fire off a few and the answers, and then I'll come back to you for your thoughts on a couple of these. So we've been asked whether the audit's compulsory. Do all firms need to conduct an audit? And Ross did touch upon this, that it is a size and nature requirement. So it'll look at things about the amount of work you do, number of offices and fee earners. But what I would say, if you're a smaller firm and thinking, do I need to do one, that, excuse me, there is a requirement for all firms that you have to monitor compliance with your PCPs under Regulation 19.3E, and that isn't a size and nature requirement. So it might be that this sort of doing an audit ticks 2 boxes if you're uncertain about that one. Brian has asked us if CULPS as Coulter, the compliance lead for firms, would you expect them to have a good grasp of the firm's AML policies, controls and procedures? I think they need to be aware. I think this is, again, very much determined on the firm structure and how the firms are run. But you're absolutely right. They do have that overall responsibility for legal practice, but certainly you'd anticipate they'd delegate a big chunk of that function to the MLRO and the MLCO. But I think having that general awareness is certainly helpful. But you'd expect those roles to work together if they're different people. And another one from Brian, which I think is a really good question around if a firm is using locums within regulated areas of work, what screening should you undertake? And I think, Ross, relevant employees is very wide, isn't it? It's about detection and prevention of money laundering.
It is, but this sort of thing can be cut to the particular cloth that you're looking at. And, for example, you may not need to get, if you, absent of any requirements of accreditation schemes, if your normal practice is to do a DBS check on employees, you may consider that it's not necessary for locums, but they may be better subjected to other types of checking. So regulatory checking, maybe checking the last couple of places on their CV, just making sure that the CV is accurate, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the key is that they're still included, they're covered, even though they're locum workers. The extent of those checks will probably, rest on whether they're through an agency. The agency may have done checks that you can use to sort of rely on those two elements of it. Or as Ross says, you might need to do extra checks. And also, when you're thinking of your risk-based approach, you can look at things like, do they have access to the money? And also the free checks that Ross has mentioned that we do at the SRA in terms of regulatory history and some basics that we'd probably expect across the board. So we had a question from Emma about the MLRO ahead of compliance undertaking the audit, and hopefully Ross has now covered that, sort of saying that they wouldn't be sufficiently independent. We've also had a question from David about the costs of conducting AML due diligence, and we have got a Q&A on the website on that, but essentially you can relay that cost, and we can include that a link to that QA in the guidance links. Another question we had from Tom, which I'll put to you, Ross, is about does each law firm have to have a dedicated money laundering reporting officer?
Now, this also ties with a question we've had from Rebecca, where she's asking,
Yes.
do you find that compliance with the regulations is better when the same person fulfills both roles? Now, money laundering compliance officer, as opposed to reporting officer, is a size and nature requirement. Again, only the very smallest firms really, we would say, don't need one. Most firms who conduct regulated work are going to need somebody nominated into that role. The same is not true of the money laundering reporting officer. If you do regulated work, even if there's only one or two of you, somebody needs to be the MLRO. As to does every firm have a dedicated one, it depends what you mean by dedicated. If you mean if they're one person whose only job is being the money laundering reporting officer, then we occasionally find that. It's not very common, but some firms find that things work better that way. In terms of the best question of do we find that compliance is better when the same person fulfills the role of MLRO and MLCO, interestingly, we will be looking at that question potentially later on this year when we're contacting 50 firms about the way that they apportion work between MLROs, MLCOs, and how many hats, so to speak, people may be wearing and what the impact on their working lives is. I think this is something where it's for firms really to decide what is best for them. Some larger firms may find that having a large volume of suspicious activity reports means that it's effectively a full-time job to be an MLRO. I would say that isn't very common, but it's something that firms may want to look at. Equally, it's helpful to spread the workload out potentially by the use of deputies. Now, it could be that the MLRO and MLCO are different people and deputise for each other, or it could be that one person holds both roles and deputises the two parts out to different people or to one person. It's entirely up to firms to decide how they're looking at that. But if we find any interesting information on that point, we will relay it back once we've done our thematic review.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something we know one size probably doesn't fit all in this area, and we're really keen to learn more about how different firms and structures handle this. And we did get asked earlier about sort of the size of firms we visit, types of firms. We visit lots of different types of firms, sort of from sole practitioners to larger international firms and across England and Wales. And for a number of our work, we think that's really important to get that spread. Mm-hmm. And another really interesting one around, do we only need to undertake source of funds checks and collect evidence on monies actually coming into our client account? It's something we were discussing quite recently, actually. And if you look back to Regulation 28, not necessarily, there could be transactions where you're acting for a different party, or money is not moving hands your side, but actually you're involved in a transaction that requires you to do a certain level of customer due diligence, and therefore to protect yourself in essentially committing money laundering, you do need to know about the source of those funds, even if they're dealing with another party. And that might be simply satisfying yourself with the account from another solicitor if they're represented, or sort of getting some information, and if you felt it appropriate evidence. But I think that's a really good question, and sort of don't be fooled, it's just about money into your account. Was there something you wanted to add there, Ross?
Yes, on that point, it's also worth having an eye to the requirements in Regulation 33.
Yeah.
There's some new requirements brought in 2020 about high-risk third countries. Now, these are countries which have been identified by the European Commission as, well, high-risk third countries. It's not the same as geographical risk in a wider sense, but the list is online, and I think we've put out a summary last year where you can see this list, or check the European Commission website. These are specified countries that, for whatever reason, is seen as being particularly risky. The reason that I bring this in here is because there are certain checks that you need to carry out on not only your client, but potentially on the counterparty, if they're established in one of these high-risk third countries. And that includes obtaining additional information on the additional information on the nature of the business relationship, obtaining information on the source of funds and source of wealth. I would encourage anyone who's wondering to have a look on the European Commission website. That list has now been updated in October last year. And although we've now left the European Union, that list is still with us until such time as the regulations change. You may have nothing to do with anybody who's established in those jurisdictions, but just be aware that if you are, then you potentially have to do checks on the counterparty as well as your own client.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Ross. I think it's easy to think about enhanced due diligence and just think about PEPs and politically exposed persons, and Regulation 33 is a really important one of the sort of wider circumstances, in addition to where necessary that source of funds and source of wealth come into play. So I'm just going to pick up a couple more, and then I think we're coming to a close. So someone's asked, if we receive a visit and corrective action is needed, will we be given an opportunity to take the action and evidence what we've done, and will this lead to regulatory action being taken? And I think it's really keen to note those firms that have had a visit will know that the person that's attended is keen there to support after and make sure that you understand what's expected. If there is any follow-up, Ross or other members of the team are on hand to have a call and answer any questions. And definitely, we'll be looking to bring you back into compliance and will not necessarily lead to regulatory action, and if we can, be avoided. So I'm sorry if we've not had time to answer your questions. We'll look through them and see if there's anything we can cover in future webinars and communications. If it's a scenario-based question we've missed, then please do get in touch with our professional ethics team for specific guidance. And on that note, we really want to hear what you thought of this webinar. Was it useful? What type of content would you like to see covered in the future? So if you could click on the link below the video stream and let us know what you think. It only takes 2 minutes to complete. We'd really appreciate it. And do look out for our next webinar where we're hoping to cover matter risk assessment. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.